Hello and welcome to episode 19 of the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination
can leave you with a chili on your desk. Shoot.
Just pulled it back in time.
Yeah. No more failures like last time. No.
That wasn't a failure. That was a minor bump in the road.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Wayne Kelly.
And I'm Leah Osborne. Whoops.
And today we're going to be talking about powerful dialogue. In the last episode, we were talking about screenwriting and some of the tricks you can use for writing for the screen, and how some of those tips also work for prose writing, novel writing, short stories, etc. And we're kind of going to focus more on dialogue today. But before that, what kind of week have you had, Leah?
A painful, gooey one.
You've had conjunctivitis, haven't you?
I have, and it's so not fun. It's like the boy, well, I say the boy, one of the boys, the first one, he's had it before. And I'm kind of like, he looks really uncomfortable. But now I know the agony, I know the pain, I know the bright lights, I know that I can't see. And while he got to have drops because he's 3, I had an ointment, and that shit sticks to your eyelashes and makes everything look really minging. And you can taste it, by the way. This is a new thing. You can taste eye drops.
Ugh. I saw you put that on Facebook, but I just...
Yeah. I wasn't kidding. You can taste it. It's kind of put me off using anymore, and it's a shame because I really need to keep using them for another day or two at least, and I just don't want to.
There must be some medical scientific reason for that. So if there are any budding scientists or anybody that's an eye expert, let us know why Leah can taste those drops, unless... Or is it the ointment you've been tasting?
It's the ointment. I don't get the drops because I'll keep still because I have to do it myself. I'm not going to thrash around like a 3-year-old and cry. So they give me the ointment and they give the boy the drops because it's a bit less traumatic for him.
Does it smell quite strongly?
No, it doesn't.
Right. Because smell and taste are really obviously really heavily linked. So I could understand if you could taste it if it was a really strong smelling.
No, just...
Well, at least it's a bit of research. One of your characters can have conjunctivitis now in a future story, and you know what you're talking about.
That was nothing to do with writing, was it? That whole update.
Doesn't matter.
I also edited stuff.
Yeah, I've done some editing as well. I haven't done any writing at all, but I did edit a story down. I can't remember whether I mentioned this in the last podcast or not. Yeah, I edited down my Johnny and Clive story.
Oh, yes.
Robot bank robber. Yeah, I had to get about 500 words off that. And I've just managed it. I just got it under the 1,700 word count.
Are you entering this for is that your entry for the crime competition?
Yeah, although I might enter 2. I might enter that, and I don't normally do this. I never enter 2 things to the same competition, but because they're so different, I might enter that, and I might enter the other one that I've got about a wasp features prominently in it.
Oh yeah,
yeah, that's obviously quite serious. So yeah, I think I'm going to put those 2 in. So,
do you know what's really weird about that?
What?
You're considering entering 2. And I'm considering entering 2, and that's not something I ever do, ever.
No, I've never done it
like
before.
Yourself. But I've had this idea kind of knocking around in my head since last Thursday, actually. And I'm desperate to get it on the page because I think it would make a brilliant crime story if I could pull it off, because it's funny as well. So it's a serious crime, but it's lighthearted, and I think it's just silly enough that people might pay attention to it if I can get the damn thing written down. So
yeah, definitely. Those things tend to go well in writing magazine as well.
Crossing my fingers. Yeah,
go for it.
We'll see.
Good idea. So today we're talking about dialogue, as I mentioned up front. So how do you find writing dialogue? Do you like writing dialogue? I know some writers are not very keen on it. They don't like it. They just like to keep ploughing through the prose, and they're not that interested in doing dialogue, even though they know that their writing will be better with it. What's your kind of view on it?
in the early days, it was something that I got complimented on a lot, which made me feel quite good when everything else was a bit lacking. And now I think because I understand more about what dialogue is for, I spend more time on it than I used to, and I enjoy writing it more than I used to, because I know what I'm doing with it, as opposed to just writing something that sounds authentic, quote unquote. You can't see me making the quotey fingers, but I'm making quotey fingers. Authentic. Yeah.
So what you? So you're saying now you know what it's for. What is it for?
There we go. Dialogue is for painting a picture about your characters and for driving your story forward. That's what your dialogue is for. And I think even though I liked writing dialogue in the early days, more quotey fingers, I didn't necessarily use it for those two things. It kind of happened by accident. And now it happens because I've made it that way, and that's more fun.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's great for bringing the story to life anyway, and your characters to life. It makes your characters seem more realistic, puts flesh on the bones to the character, and it's a great way when, especially if you've got a story or you've got it might not necessarily be a high action story or a high action scene, but dialogue is still a great way to add impetus to the scene and get characterization across.
Yup.
Because the way that obviously your character speaks can tell you so much about the character. So what are some of the tricks that you use with dialogue? What are some of the kind of tells, or how do you think about dialogue? That's probably a better way of putting it. How do you think about dialogue? So you've got a character in your mind, you start writing a story. Maybe it started with a character, maybe it started with a story. But how do you start to hear or devise the way that they speak?
I sometimes have an idea before I start of what they sound like, or I decide where they're from, if that makes sense. Because, that's a really tricky question. Because obviously people sound different wherever they come from. They sound different based because of what their jobs are. They speak a certain way. They sound different because of their age. You know, there's all sorts of things that influence how a person speaks and how they don't speak. And what I try to do is take small things about the way real people speak and use those in the character to give a flavor of what I want to show. So are they young? Are they old? Are they common? Are they not common? What's the acronym for that?
Posh.
Thank you. Words are hard. To show those things. And one of the ways I do that is through verbal tics. I think they're called verbal tics. So there's a phrase or a word that one particular character might use fairly often, and that's theirs. So I use it to kind of characterize their dialogue. So Cove Razor Blades, for instance, Nick says babe a lot, maybe too much. And he sometimes slips into South African dialect if he gets really annoyed or super duper happy. So that's one of the ways I show some of the history about him. He's South African. And if he gets too emotional, he can't control the words he uses. And, dialogue device. Stuff like that.
Yeah. You've got a lot of tools, haven't you, that you can use with dialogue, because you can use slang, obviously, that you've mentioned, and verbal tics. It could be a stutter. It could be somebody procrastinates a lot or takes a long time to say something. But there's also length of speech.
Yes.
Length of sentences in dialogue, I think, is a really good way to show how the person speaks. Are they monosyllabic? Do they use? And then that moves into vocabulary.
Yeah.
So, which kind of what you touched on in terms of their background. So, are they very verbose? Have they got a big vocabulary? Do they like to use lots of big long words, or do they get straight to the point? Do they swear a lot? Profanity is another good tool within dialogue. Obviously, sometimes you're limited to how much you can use. But again, even with profanity, even if you've got a story that's got lots and lots of profanity and lots of, particularly if you're writing like an urban crime story or something,
like yours,
like the one that I happen to be writing at the moment, it's on my mind. But obviously the potential is there in that world. Pretty much most of the people in it will swear, they'll use profanity, but then within that, there's like how they use profanity. A young person, that's late teens, early 20s will swear in a different way to a person that's in their late 50s or their 60s. And also, you can be really creative. Chuck Wendig is brilliant at using really creative profanity. I want to get out of the habit of mentioning Chuck on every single episode.
No, don't, because he's awesome.
but he is great at swearing creatively, even just in his blog posts, let alone in his...
Yeah. He's a colourful man.
That can show a lot. Length, as I say, length, how much they speak, length of sentences, whether they interject, sometimes they might not even answer. They might get asked a question and they might not answer it. And that's something else that we can talk about. So in terms of flow of dialogue, so a conversation between two or more characters.
Yeah. What
are the kinds of things that people need to think about? Because in my experience, one of the dangers can get very, you've got a certain amount of information that you want to get across, a bit like we talked about in the screenwriting episode, the previous episode about getting exposition, and it's almost like a shopping list, and you just get from A to B in a very kind of boring, straight to the point way. But that's not necessarily the best way to do it, is it?
No, because people don't talk that way. I mean, I'm just kind of thinking about what I said a couple of minutes ago and how it rambled. That's how people talk, unfortunately. It's not just me. You all talk like that too. Admit it or don't, however you like. So you need to get some of that, the essence of that, the feel of that in dialogue. When you're writing dialogue for a character, people ramble, they cut themselves off, they have a thought in the middle of another thought and then go off on a tangent, and then they come back around to where they were, if they're Eddie Izzard or something like that. So you have to show some of that in the dialogue as well.
I mean, one good technique that I've seen used before is answering a question with a question, which is, again, something that people tend to do in real life. People don't always answer not necessarily in a kind of politician avoiding the question type way. Just sometimes it's kind of how they answer it. Yeah. So if somebody said, are you going out tonight? What, down to the club? And it's kind of things like that. So rather than just saying, yes, I am. Where are you going? I'm going to the club. You answer it, you skip straight away.
Yeah.
And I think a way that you can work out whether it sounds right and whether it's going to read right is by, like with most writing, reading it aloud. And I think dialogue particularly really, really does benefit from reading aloud.
Oh, yes.
I think if you do that, you can really pick up things straight away and you get a sense of what it sounds like and how it plays. But the other thing is, and again, I can't remember whether we mentioned this in the screenwriting episode or not, but your characters need to sound different on the page. And out loud. So again, reading out loud is a really good way to see if that's the case. I came to the critique group last week and I read my story that we're talking about. And even as I was reading it, before I even got the critique, I was aware that some of the characters did sound very similar. And so that's something that I need to address in the edit. But that really became apparent when I was reading it out loud to the group.
Yeah, it's sometimes you can only hear it when you hear it. That sounds weird, but it's true. You don't see it or hear it unless you hear it.
Yeah, and I think, again, the easiest dialogue to write is the character that you've got a really strong sense of in your mind before you even start writing. Because you just kind of hear them in your head. They talk the way that they talk because that's how they talk. You just know instinctively, I think it's more difficult to write secondary characters or characters that might just come into a scene and then they're back out again, or they're minor characters. I think they're more difficult to write sometimes.
I think for minor characters or secondary characters, you have to use a whole lot more tricks. Because if they're not important enough to learn loads and loads about them, you don't have the kind of background fluff to pad them out and do some of the work that the dialogue should do on its own. So you have to use a lot more tricks. Like if you need to show that they're a timid person, then you'd show that in your dialogue through maybe short, hesitant phrases, incomplete words, things like that. Are they open to being interrupted quite often? And, they don't fight back against that. Stuff like that. You have to show it in a different way.
So presumably, especially in that example that you've just given, tags play quite an important part in that. Explain, just for people that might not be familiar with that term, if they're just new to writing, what do we mean when we talk about tags, dialogue tags and speech tags?
Okay. Oh, wait, no. Oh, hang on. Dialogue tags and speech tags. Okay. Speech tags is that he said, she said crap. He exclaimed, he shouted, he yelled, he blah, he blah, he blah. There's a lot of debate over whether or not you should just use said and be done with it, or if you want to use more colourful words, that's up to you. But there are other ways to tag text. There are other ways to tag dialogue as well. And they can be action tags. I call them action tags, which is why I got muddled for a second there. Rather than tagging the dialogue to say such and such said it, you give an action or you continue the prose following that person. And then it's very clear that that person spoke and you're covered without ever having to have said.
Yeah. So I know what you mean.
Nailed it.
Yeah, nailed it. So for example, I don't like my job. Wayne scratched his nose. In fact, I hate it. It's that kind of thing, isn't it? So and again, that comes across in the way that it's formatted on the page.
Yeah.
It's still in the same it's still in the same paragraph, so that it's the same person speaking. And sometimes it's action tags serve multiple purposes, don't they? Because sometimes it's just a case of you can show something through an action, like you just said, someone's nervous or they're worried or they might be lying or whatever. But I think they're also important as well is if you have got quite a lot of dialogue or somebody says, gives quite a long speech or something, it's quite nice to break it up on the page as much as anything else. And it also grounds the scene in reality, because if you're not careful, if you just have dialogue, you don't have any action tags and you don't have any bits of description in between or anything, for me, it can sometimes become two or more disembodied voices.
Floating head syndrome.
Yeah. That's a better way of saying it, yeah.
Floating heads, yeah, that's courtesy of an editor of mine. It's and I think what people sometimes forget is that dialogue isn't just about the words the characters say. Dialogue has a very strong relationship with the prose around it, and you should never forget that the pair go hand in hand. So if you have a string of dialogue, you can up the ante, if you like, with that string of dialogue by what you put around it. That action or that piece of movement, whatever your prose is talking about, can, what's the word I'm looking for? Why are words so hard today? Can amplify, thank you, amplify what your dialogue is doing. And the pair, it works the other way as well. So what the dialogue your character comes out with can then amplify what's going on in the prose. The pair have a very, very tight relationship, and you shouldn't forget that one influences the other. Phew. Yeah. I'm really struggling here. I don't know why.
No, I know what you mean. So you just flicking back a little bit. So you mentioned obviously we talked about action tags and all that kind of stuff, but tags as in he said, she said, he exclaimed, whatever. You're right. There is this argument. Some people say, no, you should never, ever use anything except said. And some people think literally the opposite, and that said is very boring and that you should try to be have as much variety as possible. I don't agree with either of those. I think it should be. I usually use said. I use said most of the time. But having said that, pardon the pun, he chuckled to himself. I think sometimes the right alternative to said it's better than using an adverb. So instead of saying he spouted angrily or whatever, or you can say he spat or he shouted, or that's enough. You don't need the adverb. Or rather than he said angrily or he said annoyed or whatever, you can just say he shouted or he yelled. Get the hell out of here, he yelled. And sometimes it's implicit in the dialogue. You don't even need a tag. We haven't even talked about that. But if you want to keep the pace, if you've got you want to have a really fast-paced exchange between two characters, you can drop a lot of tags and you don't need them once you've kind of established the order of where we're going. Especially if there's only two people in the scene, you can really get away with it. And then all you need to watch, as you've said, is your floating head syndrome. Just make sure it just doesn't become two disembodied voices. But you can find that a lot where you don't actually need it, especially when someone's reading it. I mean, if you're reading it out loud and you're on your own, you're not doing two different voices, then it can get confusing. Again, you can find that when we're at a critique group sometimes. Then hang on, I'm struggling to pick up which one's which, but you will see it on the page.
Well, that's why your dialogue needs to be strong enough for the character that it belongs to. You should be able to attribute a line of dialogue to a character without a speech tag. You should be able to say, this character said that, and I know that because. And like I do every episode, this is how I link it back to Buffy, because you knew it was coming. There are lines of... I'm looking at a script now, actually. I'm looking at the very first script for the first episode, Welcome to the Hellmouth. Even if you took off the big capital letters saying which character these lines belong to, I know because it sounds like them and it is them. It's a line that belongs to that character and nobody else could say it because it wouldn't sound right. And that's what your dialogue needs to do. It needs to belong to the character that you attribute it to. And then, actually, you don't end up needing very many tags because it's implicit from a line of dialogue who said it. Boom, boom. Ha.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I've only recently I've experienced the opposite of that when it goes wrong with a program that I originally liked the first series of it for UK listeners, which was W1A, which was when you saw it, it was kind of it's the BBC. It's about the BBC. It's kind of a satire on the BBC, and it's about the BBC. And the first series was really, really good. I identified with a lot of it, and it was very funny. But the second series honestly, there's great big chunks, there's great big scenes where you could just take the line that person said and give it to anybody else around the table. It doesn't, and it would, they're interchangeable. Oh, no. It's just really, really interchangeable, and it's really sporty. But that is a good example of when it does go wrong, and you've not got that attribution that you're talking about.
Is this the 2012 Olympics thing?
It's the follow-on from that. Yeah, it's the same guy, it's the same character, and he's gone from the 2012 Olympics to now he's got a role at the BBC.
I bet Dave's watching this.
I really
sounds right up his street.
Yeah, I haven't heard anybody else slagging off the second series, to be fair. But for me, it's kind of lost something. It just didn't hold me at all. And I was trying to put my finger on it when I was watching it a couple of weeks ago, and that's definitely what it is. It's like they all sound the same. It's like if you close your eyes, you would struggle to know sometimes who's saying what because the dialogue is so similar.
That's some great quotes, though.
Part of it is because it's come out of the fact that because it's the environment that it's set in, and everybody has got a certain way of speaking, and they use internal speech and they use acronyms and all this kind of thing. It's kind of come out of that. But if you've got, half a dozen characters around that are all sounding like that, it does get very, very boring. And you start to think, well, why is that character or those two characters? Why are they even in the scene? You don't need them. You could just give their lines to that other person. They don't need to be there. So that's that's something that you need to think about it. And again, dialogue is a great way of finding out whether you've got a redundant character in your story. I always find.
Yeah, do you know what? I dumped a character in the edit I'm doing for Walking the Razor's Edge because I was looking at it going, this guy doesn't belong here. He doesn't say anything that means anything. Bye. Which
I mean, it's a good way of finding out, even if not always whether they belong in the whole story, but it's a good way of finding out whether they belong in the scene or not. Because you start writing dialogue and you're halfway through it and you're like, hang on, there's 4 people in here and only 3 of them are speaking.
Yeah.
What's happening with the other guy? Well, he's got nothing to say. He's not adding anything to the scene. So why is he there? Take him out of the scene.
Yep.
Or like you've just said, take him out of the whole thing. If he's that weak a character.
Well, that was Savage. That was a Savage example, but he didn't need to go. So.
No, that's a good example. So again, it's kind of only use dialogue if you've got something to say, and it always needs to be pertinent, as you said, to the prose and the story that's around it. And it does need to sound natural and appropriate to the character that's speaking it, but it can't be purely realistic, because otherwise, if you did, it would just be too long and you wouldn't get anywhere, and there'd be pages and pages of people talking about the weather and going around the houses and all that kind of thing.
God, could you imagine if dialogue in a book was actually like the dialogue you hear in a coffee shop or in a games around the game table?
Well, that's why, I mean, going back to the screenwriting thing, which is why we kind of paired these 2 episodes together. There's lots of films where you think, or dramas or whatever, TV programs, where you think, oh, that's a really great example of how people speak from that environment or from that world. And it's not. It's an entertaining version. It's a great reflection of it. Sometimes it can appear realistic. You've got realistic dialogue, but anybody, the reality is people don't exchange zingers all day. It's not like bat, 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 this great rhythm that you get in these really well written things like Mad Men and stuff like that. Unfortunately, in your everyday workplace, people are not that witty, and they're not they're not that fast on their feet. But obviously, if you didn't have it like that, it wouldn't be an entertaining program. So you need to make it entertaining, and it needs to be pertinent to the story, or it needs to tell you something about the character.
Yes.
Or push the scene on or the story on in some way. But as we've talked about in the screenwriting episode, sometimes it can be less about moving the plot on and just as much about showing the character.
Yeah.
And it's a great way to show a character is the way that they speak and the way that they answer people or respond to others. So that's something to bear in mind as well.
Have you seen Warm Bodies?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Cool. Right. Okay. I'm not going to be talking to someone who doesn't get it then.
No.
I saw it last week. Right. And this is related, I promise. That scene at the beginning, because I missed the first minute or so, but the scene at the beginning where I was talking, and I say talking in a very loose way, to his mate M.
Yeah.
And they're just grunting. Why can't I spell warm? I thought that was actually really good example of not dialogue, but I don't know, pseudo dialogue, because obviously it had a voiceover.
Yeah,
but I think it was 2 characters talking without talking, and sometimes your dialogue needs to be able to do that. I don't know if I'm explaining this very well.
I think I know what you mean. What it's kind of, again, it kind of links back to something that we said in the screenwriting episode, where we talked about sometimes what the character is saying is not really what they're saying.
Subtext. There we go.
Yes.
Captain Subtext.
Yeah.
Aha.
And I referenced The Wire because that just happens to be something that I'm rewatching at the moment. And that program is so jam-packed of subtext. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's stuff going on in that all the time where people are talking about, supposedly they're talking about really, really bland everyday things, but the way that they're talking about it and what they're talking about so much more, and it always relates back to the bigger story. And one of the things that and you know that it's important, and it's really important to the show, because one of the things that The Wire does is at the beginning of each episode, on the screen, as the titles finish, on the screen is a line of dialogue from one of the characters.
Oh yeah, I forgot I did that.
Yeah. And you kind of waiting for it, as you watch it. Oh, there it is. And it's picked out for a reason. It'll be like the theme of the episode, or it'll relate back to something, whatever. And what's quite clever is when it does it, when you see it, the line of dialogue written like that on its own on the screen, it gives it a level of importance that if you'd have, just at least on the first watching of the thing, you could miss it. But it kind of gives it this I don't know, this extra meaning that you didn't necessarily spot on the first time you watched it. So yeah, that's a really good example of subtext. So yeah, a lot of the time people can be arguing about something and really, really passionate and getting really, really upset about something very, very boring. It could be about the washing up, which on the face of it doesn't mean anything to the plot or anything else, but it's the reason behind the argument and the way that they're arguing. And
yeah.
Like, as you say, the subtext. So yeah, dialogue is a great way to bring out subtext, and it's something that you need to think about.
I need to rewatch The Wire.
When you're writing.
You're bringing it all back to me now.
You definitely do. It's great.
I'm still working on Angel though, sorry. One more season to go.
Right. Buffy's
finished. Oh my God, the ending of Buffy was amazing. Just to completely change the subject and then bring it back. It was really good. And you know what? The dialogue in that was great too. There's a line... I don't care about spoilers at this point. It's so old. Buffy's about to run up and leave Spike behind because he's saving her ass and she has to leave. And she goes, "Oh, I'm sorry this is happening. I love you." And Spike, who has the best dialogue from out of anybody in the entire show, this show, Buffy and Angel, he goes, "No, you don't, love, but thank you for saying it." And I'm like, that's heartbreaking. And it's classic Spike. He's being flippant and blasé about it, but because his previous dialogue tells you this, you know that inside he is dying. And also literally because he's on fire. But it was the whole episode. I was in bits by the end of it. I was like, what a bright light, Joss Whedon.
Yeah. We're always referencing TVs.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
But TV and films are a great source of, well, obviously for inspiration for writing anyway, but they offer great examples of writing great dialogue, because obviously that's what they mostly are. They mostly consist of dialogue and screenplays. It's the main tool in a script, aside from what the character does, the actual action. So if you want to learn to write great dialogue, aside from going out and listening to natural speech patterns and picking up some cool sayings and rhythms of speech from real people, you should also check out some, top drawer cinematic or televisual masterpieces.
Like Buffy.
Like Buffy. Yeah.
A bit.
Or Godfather.
Yeah. Do you know what? Not seen any of them.
Haven't you?
I haven't, and it's like it's a weird gap. Feels odd.
It is. You need to redress that.
I'll sort it out. Do you know what? I bought Serenity the other day, and I realized that I hadn't watched it yet. I was like, oh my God, I'm a bad person.
I haven't seen that either.
I'll watch it this week and I will lend it to you. Oh, you're not even there on Saturday, are you?
I'm not there for another. I thought I was going to be there the week after next, but I'm not going to be there either. So it's going to be like 3 weeks.
We'll fix it. Yeah, at some point I will lend it to you, because it's Joss Whedon again. It's Buffy guy, but doing awesome things in space. And yeah, again, rammed with amazing dialogue and fantastic 3-dimensional characters. And basically, look at anything by Joss Whedon.
Yeah, Joss Whedon is good at dialogue.
Not that I'm biased or anything.
No, I agree. He's good at dialogue.
And yet you don't like Buffy, you weirdo.
No, I couldn't really connect. But as I've said before, I don't really think I'm its core demographic.
No, I guess not. Nah.
No, I don't. It's not really grabbing me. Yeah. So yeah, dialogue really important. Obviously, as important as anything else, and a good technique, and I think a good practice thing. Just before we kind of round up towards the end, this week's homework, if you like, is to, if you have an idea for a short story or anything else, see if you can write it entirely with dialogue, even if it's just 200-word story or something.
Yeah.
It's a good way it's a good way to practice dialogue, is just write entirely in dialogue, write a scene and see what you can get across. I mean, obviously it's what you have to do a lot of the time in a script or a play or anything else, but it's good practice, and it's a good way to practice your dialogue and to get it, especially if you give yourself a word limit. It's a really good way to see how sharp you can write dialogue and see how quickly you can get your point across and still make your characters sound believable.
Yeah.
So that's this week's homework.
Cool. Yeah, go do it, people. We'll be marking you next week.
And aside from that, as I say, make sure you read it aloud. Watch your tags. Make your characters sound different. And as you said, make sure that it chimes nicely with what's around it, with the prose and the story.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely. So it'd be interesting to hear what everyone out there is doing, how they go about writing dialogue. Have they got any special techniques? Do they include it in their characterization when they're thinking about a character and they're drafting a character? Do they think of dialogue as they do it? Do they have sayings? Something that I read today by Drew Chile, blog post, talked about writing different things you can do when you're facing writer's block. But one of them was just thinking about what your character might do in any given situation, but not only that, what they would say, whether they would have a saying. So if they were up the creek or they were in a very, very difficult situation, how would they react in dialogue? What would be the types of things that they say? How do they berate somebody? Do they have a set insult or a favorite insult that they tend to use? Things like this can be great ways to think about your character, but they also help you with writing realistic dialogue.
No, yeah, that's cool.
So I might mention that in the show notes as well, actually, because that was the blog post is not specifically about that, but that did stand out when I was reading it. So thanks to Drew for that. Okay, great. So you can keep tweeting us, finding us on Facebook and on the web. We're a Twitter JU Podcast, Facebook Joined Up Writing Podcast, and on the web joinedupwriting.co.uk. Yeah. I'm on Twitter, which is Mr. Kelly 2U, the number 2, the letter U. Yeah. You're on Twitter.
Certainly am. It's Ileandra X Raven, combination of my 2 pen names.
And so, so we just thanks for listening to the Joined Up Writing Podcast. Let's get joined up. I'm Wayne Kelly.
And I'm Lee Osborne.
Happy writing and see you next time.
Bye.